there is much more in the book of Ruth than I've ever really realized until I come back. And every time I come back and study a portion of Scripture, there's more than I first realized. I don't think that's new to anybody, but especially this time through it. I've read the book of Ruth 100 times in my life, I guess. But I've never really studied through it as I've been doing this time around. And there's just so much, and particularly this week was difficult trying to just figure out what to cut out and what not to talk about, because there's so many things that were going on in just this chapter here. And I think I cut it off about 3 times of how much we were going to cover, and figure we'll just have to do more of it next time. So fortunately, this isn't the last time that we get to meet together and discuss it. But this morning, we're just going to look at first 10 verses. And if you have been following with us in this story, then you know that we are finally in Bethlehem. We are finally back to the place where the story began and has been kind of forgotten for 10 or so years. Larry loaned me a DVD of this, the Book of Ruth, the Sight and Sound theater put on Ruth 10 years ago or so, and I've been watching that in bits and pieces this week, and just really makes the story come alive, and thinking about how all of this must have taken place, especially when we read stories like this in the Bible that are not necessarily instructional, but they're narrative and telling us story, and from that we gather lessons and we gather truths. It helps us to really dig into the details and really figure out what's going on. And I think that had we lived in this time, if we were of the Jewish culture and we were very familiar with being an Israelite at this time, there would be more for us to even gather than those of us in the 21st century America can gather. But with help from just studying and from dissecting the words and even the historical resources, we can gather quite a bit about what's going on at this time. Really, chapter 2 was set up with the last part of verse 22 in chapter 1, when it says that they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. So the timing of this is important to understand. And as Ruth and Naomi make their way into Bethlehem, they arrive at the time that is time for barley harvest. And there are going to be a couple of different other harvests coming on, a wheat harvest later on. But at this point, they're at the first harvest, I imagine. They've arrived, and they are settling back in. If you understand the law and how that how possessions and how things stayed in families, then it'll help you to maybe make a couple more connections that we won't necessarily talk about. But maybe that a casual observer might ask questions about, where did Naomi live and how did she, get back, and all of these different things. But we see the very beginning here. What if we call this a play? This would be Act 2 or Act 3, depending on how you divide it up. But we meet a brand new character. But we're still going to really focus on Ruth. Naomi, who has been a central figure so far and will continue to be a main character, is now going to step into the background just a little bit. And what we see in chapter 2, and really from until the rest of the book, we see mostly Boaz and Ruth, and this is where they first meet. This is, I don't know if you call it love at first sight, but definitely we see a budding romance has its beginnings right here. Daniel Block wrote this about this passage here. Ruth ultimately turned her back on her past and committed herself to an uncertain future with her mother-in-law, at whose side she was likely to experience poverty, abuse, and the sting of social ostracism. This is the scenario that we find Ruth and Naomi coming into. They're in Bethlehem. Remember, Bethlehem is the house of bread, but it's the house of Israel. And Ruth is not an Israelite. Ruth is a Moabite. Ruth is not just a Moabite. The Moabites were enemies of Israel. We'll see a few locations of those places. I'll give them to you. You can write them down and look at them later. But I want you to keep that in mind as we understand. And really what I attempted to do this morning is to get you to understand the feeling, if you can put yourself in that time and in that place where they are right now, to really to grasp the importance of everything that's happening. If we simply read it and we translate it into 21st century culture, we'll miss so much. And so I hope that you'll put yourself in that position this morning and gather what can be gathered. We see in verse number 1, this new man Boaz is introduced. It says, "And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz." Chapter 2 begins with a brief introduction, but what's interesting here is that the storyteller doesn't necessarily want us to focus on his name, whereas if we were telling stories, we might throw in the name at the very beginning to help you identify. They want to identify, or the storyteller wants to identify Boaz, not for what his name is, but for who the man is, because it's going to be very important that we understand who Boaz is and how he relates to the story. He's not just another guy. He's not just another wealthy guy. We see him described here in 3 ways. Number 1, he is a kinsman, or he is a relative. Number 2, he is a mighty man. It says, a mighty man of wealth. Now, this phrase, the mighty man, is actually used several times throughout Scripture, and it can be used to describe wealth. It can be used to describe character. It can be used to describe social standing or physical strength. When it says here that Boaz was a mighty man of wealth, it does not necessarily want us to imagine how big his muscles were. Okay, I don't think that the storyteller is trying to get us to describe this Arnold Schwarzenegger type of a man, although he could have been, we don't know. But it's much more, because it says he was a mighty man of wealth. It wants us to think more than he was a very rich guy. He was more than a mighty or strong man. In fact, some of this Hebrew terminology can be used later to describe Ruth. It will be used later on in Proverbs to describe the virtuous woman. All of these different places, and it can be used in many different contexts. And so we have to really understand who Boaz is to really understand what this phrase really wants us to pull out of there. But it says he was a mighty man of wealth, and we understand from the story that he was a wealthy landowner. He had a lot of possessions. He had, in those days, your wealth was not necessarily counted by how much gold you had in your pocket or how much you had in your stocks and bonds and IRAs and things, but how much land you had and how many workers the man had working for him would give us an indication as to his wealth. And we see also that he was a man of high social standing. He was very prominent in the community when we get into chapter 4, and we realize that. We realize that he was a man that was well-liked. We see that his interactions with his employees. So he's just a great guy, this man Boaz, and he's being introduced, and not for coincidental purposes. The last little tidbit that it gives us before it moves on for a few verses is that he is of the family of Elimelech. Now, it kind of just said that to us a minute ago when it said that he was a kinsman of her husband's, a relative of her husband's, but now it's specifically pointing out the fact that he is qualified to be the Redeemer. Remember at the end of chapter 1 when Naomi was trying to convince her daughters to go from her and go back to Moab, and she said, I don't have any more husbands, and there's no one else. I don't have any more children. There's no more hope for me. There's nothing left for me, and therefore there's nothing left for you. And she was referring to this levirate marriage where the remaining relative would take the widow for his wife and continue the family name, because as it stands right now, when Naomi dies, the name of Elimelech, whatever his last name is, will die, and with that, all of their possessions and all of their land and everything that is theirs, and it was a big deal, much more so then than it is today. And so when we see that Elimelech has a kinsman, and he is of the family, and his name is Boaz, then we see potential hope. Just like when we read at the end of chapter 1 that they came at the beginning of barley harvest, now we see another glimmer of hope, and it is that there is a qualified Redeemer. Another interesting thing, I'd never really put this together until I had someone mentioned something, and it made me think about it and look at it. I think, oh, yeah, I didn't realize that. Boaz, we learn a little bit about Boaz's family tree. I'm going to say this and you're going to go, you just figured that out? I don't know what's wrong with you. But I just figured this out, and there's always something to learn there. I can tell you. Boaz's father was Salmon. We read that at the end of chapter 4. But we don't really put too much connection to the significance of that until we read Matthew chapter 1, the genealogy of Christ. You'll never guess who the mother of Boaz was. Rahab the harlot. We read about Rahab the harlot in Joshua when the children of Israel were going to take the first of the promised land, and they marched around the city 7 times. Well, before that, they had sent spies in, and Rahab was the harlot, the prostitute, that had hidden the spies and had said, I believe that God wants you here. And basically, she makes a confession that she is on the Israelite side. She is on God's side, not on Jericho's side. She lets down the scarlet thread, and she is the only family of the whole city that is saved in this epic battle of Joshua's. His first military campaign. Well, she is integrated into the Israelite society, and as we read in Matthew 1:5, that we know that Rahab was in the line of Christ. I had known that. I had never realized that was so close, and that Boaz was half Gentile. He was half Israelite, half Gentile. This is significant for messianic purposes. As maybe more than whose mom was in the story. But if we understand that, then we can kind of see the reasons for Boaz is what we're going to see some very generous and very kind behavior towards Ruth, another Gentile. But we see this man is introduced, and then he is introduced, and then he's put on the shelf, and we're going to continue with the story. And then because Boaz is now introduced, we can just kind of insert him into the story where it is necessary. Verse number 2, we continue the story. Ruth decides to go glean in a field and get some food. Ruth the Moabitess. I haven't counted how many times, but I noticed that the storyteller is very cautious to remind us who Ruth is every few verses. She's a Moabitess. She's from Moab. She's not an Israelite. She's not welcome. She's not loved in the place that she is called home. Ruth the Moabitess says unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she, Naomi, said to her, Ruth, Go, my daughter. And she went, verse number 3. She decides to go and glean in the field. Now, 3 things about gleaning that you should know. Many of us know the practice of gleaning. We understand what that is, but in case you don't, I'll explain that. But let me give you some things that maybe you didn't realize. Number 1, gleaning was difficult work. To glean meant to walk behind the reapers and pick up that which they forgot, to pick up what they left. I don't think that gleaning would work very well in our culture today with all the tractors and the machinery that probably is much more efficient than in this day and time. But this was a survival existence. This was not a job that you were going to do in order to get ahead. This was not something that you did in order to make a few extra bucks. This was something that you did to survive, to get one more meal on the table that day and get up the next morning and do it all over again. This was in the Jewish law, and if you read in Deuteronomy and Numbers and Leviticus, when Moses is handing the law to the people from God, part of the law has to do with taking care of the poor people. And as we kind of move into the second thing about gleaning, is that it was debasing work or humiliating work. Because in God's law, He provided for the poor, He provided for the widows, He provided for orphans, and He provided for foreigners with this method of gleaning. This was the welfare system, if you will. A landowner was not supposed to glean or harvest the corners of his field. He was supposed to leave that for the poor people. And anything that he left behind, so if the reapers had gone back and we missed a stalk there, just a little handful there, they weren't allowed to go back and get it. They had to leave that for the poor. And anything that was dropped on the ground had to be left for the poor as well. So those 3 things there, things left in the corner, things left behind, and things left on the ground, had to be left for the poor people. And this was their lot in life, to follow the reapers and hope that they were careless, and hope that they weren't stingy, and they cut those corners wide to leave more in their area for them, but this is how God provided for them. But that means to be a gleaner was to admit, I am a needy person. I am poor. I am a widow, or I am alone. I have nothing else. This is all I can do. It would be one of the most degrading jobs that you could have at this time. It wasn't something that you were proud to say, I'm a gleaner. And this is Ruth's attitude. And I think Ruth understood part of this. Naomi certainly understood the implications that this has. But because they're so needy, because they have nobody to take care of them, they decide that this is the best option for them. I mentioned you can read it, Leviticus 19 and 23, and then Deuteronomy 24, if you're so inclined to look at it later on, the different rules about gleaning and things like that. But not only was gleaning difficult work and debasing, demeaning, humiliating work, but number three, it was dangerous work, especially for the women. As a single woman, it was dangerous to be in the fields alone. Assault, rape, etc. All of these different dangers lie in the fields. And we don't think of a field as the backyard, I got a field here in my garden, but think of the fields that go on forever, where they would walk out into the fields, and there's a potential to be all alone out there. And there are provisions in the law as well that deal with this type of abuse. It was a common thing to hear of, the very least, the mildest term, mistreatment of women in the fields. And Moses, Deuteronomy 22, addressed this type of abuse and mistreatment. But remember what time frame we are in, and this is the time of the judges. I was reading something that had a footnote to another article about the mistreatment of women in the book of Judges. And it piqued my curiosity, and so I read through it, and I was reading through all of the ways just in the book of Judges how women were treated, and it kind of was depressing. I felt bad. I felt awful after reading this and seeing how God's people viewed women at the time of the Judges. But if you remember, when we started this all off, the way to summarize the time frame is found in the last book of the last verse of Judges. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Everybody did what he thought was a good idea, which meant that everybody served his own pleasure. Everybody served himself. And as you read through the book of Judges, and if you're familiar with some of the stories, you can remember some of the ways that women were treated at that time. And this would have been in the exact same time frame. And so it was very dangerous for Ruth to be out there in a field as a single woman, no man to protect her. But it was doubly dangerous. It was exaggerated more, or magnified even more, not only because she was a single woman, but because she was a single foreign woman. She was a Moabite woman, and it's very careful to remind us of that, as I said, every few verses. Now, Moab was considered an enemy of Israel, and an enemy of Israel's God. They worshipped a god called Chemosh. Chemosh, part of the worship of Chemosh was child sacrifices. And we know several different false gods throughout the Old Testament that had this practice, but it was an abomination to the Israelites. And they knew the practice of the Moabites. They knew how they worshipped. And this was despicable to them, as it should be. But they were also enemies to the state as well, because when we see in, I didn't write the verses down. Oh, I did. Deuteronomy chapter 23, and we can read about it in Numbers 22. Do you remember the story of Balaam and Balak, when Balaam was hired to curse Israel, and he wasn't supposed to go, and then he decided to go anyways, and then God was going to kill him, and the donkey saw the angel, and he kept veering off the path, and then Balaam whips his donkey, and his donkey says, "What are you beating me for?" And Balaam has the talking donkey right there. Well, the king that was trying to hire Balaam to curse Israel was the king of Moab. So the Moabites were the enemies of Israel because they were trying to curse Israel. They at one point in Deuteronomy, it talks about how that when Israel left Egypt, Moab would not help them would not sell them bread, would not give them food and water. And so God reminded them, and that was one of the reasons why they were not allowed, Deuteronomy 22, I think it's 23, they were not allowed into the sanctuary, they were not allowed into the tabernacle area because of their past treatment, and for I think it was 10 generations, they were not supposed to have access as any other proselyte might be able to have because of some of the sins of earlier generations. And so for Ruth to be out here in this field, we see that there is no real reason for any Israelite or any Bethlehemite to show any kind of kindness or any kind of compassion toward this foreign woman. She could be seen, if you will, as an easy target for revenge and retaliation. You remember shortly after 9/11, the stories that would spark up of the sensitivity that people had to anybody of any Middle Eastern race. Even just because they had darker skin, people were on high alert. And I remember reading stories and hearing stories on the news about how people would assault and even kill people just because they thought, you're one of them, I'm going to take it out on you. All the frustration that I have, my patriotism because of what happened on 9/11, now I'm going to take it out on you. And this is exactly the type of scenario that Ruth was walking into. She knew, my people are not welcome in Israel, and the Bethlehemites would not be welcome in Moab. The story doesn't tell us, but it's definitely likely that Elimelech and Naomi had a learning curve. They had to get through this, you're Jews in the land of Moab. You're not welcome here, but they had to overcome that. Well, here Ruth is doing the exact same thing, but in the opposite country. And it is very possible that Ruth going out into the field would be seen as an easy target for this revenge and justifiable, in their minds, retaliation. Again, people doing what they think is right. And so Ruth going out into the field was not just her going out, humbling herself to get some food. It was her risking her safety, and possibly even her own life, to provide for Naomi and herself. And she had to realize the danger and the difficulties that lie in the field, but she went ahead anyway. Block Road hearers need to recall that the opening line of the book had set these events in the days of the judges when men violated and abused women with impunity, and the changes of landing in a field of a gracious man were remote. Because notice what Ruth says there in verse number 2. She says, let me go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. She says, I want to go out and find a gracious landowner, someone who will let me do this, and the likelihood of this is very low. The chances of her going, it'd be like, let's go to the country of Iran or the country of Afghanistan, and let's try to find a job at a place that looks well on Americans. The chances of that are pretty low. You're not necessarily going to walk in and find an abundance of welcoming committees. And here this is what Ruth is saying. I want to go out into the field and see if I can't find somebody that will show me kindness, that will show me grace. And we're reminded here that the chances are very remote. But what we see in verse number 3, call it Ruth's lucky day. And I put it in quotes there because, as you see there, I don't necessarily think that it's luck. But I like how it's written here. And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz. Her hap, that was, she happened to light upon the field. She happened to come across a field that belonged to this man we've been introduced to, named Boaz. Again, throwing in that reminder whose family he is a part of. He's a part of the family or the kindred of Elimelech. She happens to come along. She is so fortunate, and it's her lucky day that she actually finds the field of a man named Boaz. Is this a mere coincidence? Is this just a neat little twist in the story? Wow, she is so lucky. Or is there something deeper here that we're supposed to read as the readers? Are we supposed to be catching on to something going on here? We see the hope of the barley harvest as they just arrive. We see there is a redeemer. There is a relative in the family. And now we see that she just so happens to go to that very person's field in a land where she was totally unwelcome, in a land where there was probably no one else who would have done what Boaz is about to do, and where the relatives were few and far between, and maybe the ones that she still had, we know that there were at least two, that may not have been very welcoming as someone who had forsaken God and forsaken God's people and gone for 10 plus years to a foreign land and worshiped foreign gods and brought back a foreign woman. And she just so happened to find the one guy. Is that really how we read that, as a coincidence, or do we see God's hand moving behind the scenes? I find it interesting that they didn't meet in town. They actually leave the town of Bethlehem to go out into the country, into the field. They live in Bethlehem, both of them do. We'll see in just a moment that Boaz comes from Bethlehem to the field. That's where Ruth was. They didn't meet in town. They didn't meet at the market. They didn't meet at the synagogue. They didn't meet at Ruth's and Naomi's home as Boaz comes by to see his relative of some sort. They met in the field. I think it's interesting that bread was the reason that Naomi left Bethlehem in the first place. Bread was the reason that she came back to Bethlehem. Bread is the reason that Ruth meets Boaz under this town sign of Bethlehem, the house of bread. And we see that how God is using bread to fulfill His purposes and His plans. We see in the field that Boaz's first introduction to Ruth was seeing her work through difficulty in order to provide for herself and for Naomi. And Ruth's first introduction to Boaz was his generosity and his overwhelming kindness and protection of the marginalized. What some may see as sheer luck or even good fortune, we read as divine coincidence. I call it divine coincidence. That is God connecting seemingly random dots in order to work His plan. We look at some things that just happen and we think, wow, that was weird. That was a coincidence. Oh, that was lucky. We see as God saying, no, I meant for this and this to come together. I meant for this and this to happen. And I'm connecting all of the dots and I'm putting it all together, and we see God working behind the scenes. And at this point, Naomi knew that Boaz existed, but she had yet to connect him to God's plan. We read later on that even when she realizes what field Ruth has been in, she doesn't connect that God is working in a greater plan. Boaz, at this point, has heard of Ruth, but he's never actually met her. He knows nothing else about her. We read later on that Boaz has heard of a woman named Ruth who's come back, and I think everybody in town probably knows, a little town much like Sherman, New York, where everybody knows all the goings-on almost before they happen. And Ruth has no idea of anything so far except that God has been taking care of her this whole time. And here's the truth for us. Just because I can't see anything going on doesn't mean nothing is actually going on. You ever heard someone ask the question? I think it's an annoying question. But when they ask the question, if a tree falls in the middle of the forest, nobody is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Let's take a survey. How many of you think it still makes a sound, even though no one's there to hear it? Raise your hand. Good, because your ears don't make sound, right? That's the whole point of the question. How arrogant it is of me to believe that because I was not there to hear it, it didn't happen. That's what we're saying. That's what the question is asking. If the tree falls and you're not there to hear it, did it make a sound? No, because I wasn't there to hear it, so therefore it is captured in my ability to hear it, and therefore it didn't happen. So that's what we're saying here. Just because I'm not there to see it, or because I'm too blind to see it, or I'm too dumb to see what's going on, doesn't mean that nothing's going on. Guys, we know exactly what this is like. When our wives or our girlfriends are making these subtle hints to us, and they're going right over our heads. Like, I don't know what you mean by that. Will you just tell me? And reading the signs. You remember when you were dating and you were trying to interpret every little thing that she did and said? Reading the notes and trying to figure out, did she really mean that? Or maybe she meant this. Or what did she mean by that wink? Or what did she mean by, or did she have something in her eye? Or what did she mean by when she said this? Or when we were on the phone and I'll call you later. What does later mean? Should I call her back? Or is she waiting for me to call her back? Or all of these things. And just because I'm too stupid to figure out what's going on doesn't mean that nothing's going on. And it's the same way in life. Just because I can't see the future doesn't mean there's not a future development. Just because I don't see the hope doesn't mean there is no hope. Just because I can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. God is working behind the scenes. We saw in the last chapter to make all things good. He's working to make all things good. And while Bethlehem saw God's hand at this time, all of Bethlehem right now sees God's hand in the harvest as blessing and as hope and as a bright tomorrow and a bright future. We see at the same time, in the same place, another woman, Naomi, who has already told us her interpretation of it as God's hand is punishing her. And God is against her. And God is opposing her. How can two very different philosophies live in the same city and interpret the same things very differently? Just because Naomi doesn't see a future doesn't mean that God hasn't been working long before. Just because Ruth doesn't understand what's going on doesn't mean nothing's going on. God is working if we would open our eyes. John Piper said, Naomi is so oppressed here by God's bitter providence in her life that she can't see the signs of hope as they start to appear. She knows there is a God. She knows He is sovereign and rules over the national and personal affairs of men. And she knows that God has dealt bitterly with her. Her life is tragic. What she does not see with the eyes of her heart is that in all her bitter experiences, God is plotting for her glory. He goes on to say, Ruth happened to come to Boaz's field because God is gracious and sovereign even when He is silent. And that's at least the first lesson that we need to realize from there. Through Ruth and Naomi and Boaz and all the people of Bethlehem, God is doing something even when I can't see it. This is a farming community, right? We all understand it. I don't know what's going on under the ground, but I know that something is happening, and in a couple of months I will see the fruit of what has been happening for months. An ear of corn doesn't happen overnight, right? Boom! Well, how did that get there? Something's been happening for months down there, under the ground, and I couldn't see it, and I didn't know, but something was going on, and I trusted, I hoped, I believed, and it came true. And we think, wow, what a coincidence. I planted corn, and in the spring, I got corn. What a coincidence. We don't say that. We say, yeah, something was going on. We see how that happened, but in our own lives, it's more difficult. Because we don't necessarily see the seeds planted. We don't recognize them as such. We don't see the hurt and the heartache and the pain and the suffering and the loss as something that will produce good later on. But oftentimes, this is exactly what happens. We look on in verse number 4, and we see the next thing that here Ruth and Boaz meet. And here is that romantic story. This is how they will begin the story for their grandchildren when they're asked how they met. How'd you meet Mom? And how'd you meet Grandma? And how'd you meet Dad and Grandpa? And maybe they'll go all the way back to Ruth 1. Maybe they'll start here in verse number 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. Again, we see that little bit of irony, that little bit of sarcasm is just so as Ruth happened to be in the same field, and behold, Boaz comes from Bethlehem and said unto the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless thee. He gives us here more evidence as to the type of man that Boaz was. We continue on in the rest of it, and we see that Boaz inquires about this new girl in his field. He says in verse number 5, then said Boaz unto his servant that was set over the reapers, whose damsel is this? And the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, it is the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And she said, I pray you let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued even from the morning until now, and that she tarried a little in the house. A lot going on right there. But the interaction here between Boaz and his main guy there, his foreman, if you will. He sees this foreign girl in his field, and he doesn't ask, who is this? He says, whose is this? Assuming that she belonged to someone, assuming that she had a family. He's asking, who is the one that cares and provides for this woman? Who is the one who is protecting her? Who is her father? Who is her husband? What family is she belonging to? Now, we know that technically she had Naomi, but in a real sense, in a very real sense, Ruth had no one in life. It is very likely that her parents were still alive in Moab, but she had given that up, and she had moved to a brand new place. She was, in a very real sense, all alone in this world. Whose is she? Really, she's nobody's. And the response here, even from the foreman here, focuses not on who she is, but on her status as a Moabite. He says it twice in the same thing. You'd think that Boaz doesn't put his adjectives together, but he's like, she's the Moabitish damsel that came from Moab. She's Moabitish and she came from Moab. It's like, he's an American who came from America. Well, yeah. But it shows here and probably indicates here, the repetition of her heritage probably indicates the mutual feelings of all the workers. She's a Moabite. She's one of them from Moab. She isn't welcome here. She's a Moabite, Boaz. What are we going to do about it? He focuses on her status and her association there that she came back with Naomi. And verse 7, probably one of the most confusing verses in the whole book. People can't really make up their mind what it means. The two most popular, I'll give you the two most popular understandings and feelings of it and tell you kind of where I think about it, and you can make up your own mind. When it says here at the end of verse 7, it says that she hath continued even from the morning until now, that she hath tarried a little in the house. That last phrase especially just throws a wrench in it. It doesn't sound like it flows like the rest of the story. And I'll tell you that if you're confused by it, you're in good company, because everybody I've read is confused by it as well. Either it means that she has worked all day and she just took a short break in the house, or it means that she has waited all day for Boaz to show up to get permission to be able to be in his field. Because she, remember, was looking for someone that would show her favor, and she had not met Boaz until this time. Either way, it doesn't affect our story too much. Either she was doing that at the permission of the foreman, or she was doing it at the permission, waiting for the permission of the landowner. But we see that this is the woman. And so then this is what sparks Boaz's first conversation with Ruth. We get down to verse number 7, and verse number 8. Then said Boaz unto Ruth, Hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Let thine eyes be on the field that they do reap, and go thou after them. And have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And when thou art athirst, go unto the vessels, and drink of that which the young men have drawn. Then she fell on her face, and bowed herself to the ground, and said unto him, Why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldest take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger? His first little phrase, or haven't you heard? Hast thou not heard? I think is Boaz saying there, hey, are you aware of the danger that you're in right now? Of the risk that you've taken just to be here? He softens it by calling her his daughter. It's a term of endearment that is not keeping her at an arm's length. Haven't you heard, foreign Moabitish woman? No, he says, my daughter. He's speaking kindly to her. And then he gives her these 4 things. I alliterated them because I thought it might be helpful for you to remember it this way. But he gives her, number 1, he gives her permission to glean in his field. He says, I want you to stay. I want you to be here. You have permission. And whether or not she'd been there all day long, and now he got official permission, that was more, if that's the case, then she's got confirmation that she's welcome where she is. Or she can begin to glean. Number 2, he gives her a place to belong. Not only is this the place where I will let you glean today, this is the place I want you to continue coming back to. It says there in verse number 8 there, Neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. You're one of us now. I'm pulling you in. I'm welcoming you into this little family of ours, this work family. Not only do you have a place to work and gather food, but you have a place that you belong. Number 3, he gives her protection from young men. This harassment and abuse. He says there, I've charged the young men that they shall not touch thee. Later on, he will specifically go to his young men and he will say, keep your hands off her. And it's not just talking about physical abuse, but verbal abuse, because very likely this is their opportunity to make the little snide remarks about the foreign woman and get their jabs in it however they can. And Boaz is cutting them all off and saying, you treat her nice. You treat her right. You treat her kindly. Treat her as one of our own. And that's one of the ways he shows his generosity, their protection. Then he gives number 4, he gives the provision. He gives her permission, if you will, to drink from their water supply. This wasn't that someone went to Costco and got a 24-pack of bottles of water. This was probably on their way out to the field. They stopped by the wells, and the young men are bringing up the water. In this culture, women didn't drink what men drew. Women drew water for men. In this culture, foreigners didn't drink what Israelites drew. They drew the water for the Israelites, but Boaz is flipping all of that on in his head. He goes, you can go when you're thirsty, and you go to the water that everybody else is drinking from, and you enjoy some of that. And the stuff that my men drew, you take from that. Don't worry, you're not a burden on us. You're not going to be, well, I don't want to impose. You're welcome to come here. It's much like when you go to someone's house and they say, you get whatever you want out of the refrigerator. You don't even have to ask for a glass. When you go to some people's houses, you know exactly where everything is, and you don't have to ask. And you just open the fridge, and you just take what you want when you want it and how much you want, and don't feel like you're imposing on us. And that's what Boaz is trying to create here for Ruth. And now no longer is Ruth uninvited, unwelcome, or unwanted. She's not viewed as a poor widow anymore. She's not treated as an outsider or an enemy of Israel. She's not merely tolerated, but welcomed. She is not harassed, but refreshed. She's not merely present in the field, but she's now a member of the team. And as I said, as we get down to verse 15, we see Boaz will make special arrangements with his young men for Ruth. And just very quickly, let me just wrap it up in verse number 10. We see Ruth's amazement at this generosity. She makes 3 big statements here. She says, number 1, why have I found grace in thine eyes? Number 2, why would you take notice of me? Why have I found grace so that you would pay attention to me? Why would you even give me the time of day? Because notice, this is her reasoning. I'm a stranger. I'm a foreigner. Why would you treat me like this? Why would you be so good to me? I know who I am. Why would you treat me like this? See, Ruth here has no sense of entitlement to kindness or respect. She knows who she is, and she's overwhelmed and thankful for getting what she knows she doesn't really deserve from them. She knows her history, her background. She knows the gods that she once served. She knows what her people did to their people, and she comes with this expectant, anticipating attitude of, I'm probably not going to be treated well, but as long as I can get out of there with my life and a little bit of grain, we'll be okay. And instead, she gets treated. She's welcomed to the table. She's welcomed as a member. She's given all of the advantages that everybody else is given. And for you and I would say, well, yeah, that's just common decency. Let her drink or get some water when she's thirsty. But in this day, this is totally breaking culture. And yeah, let her stay with the young women. We don't want to see a young woman out there. I don't care who she is. I don't want to see her get abused and mistreated. But no, this is not the culture. This is, hey, I want you to stay here. I want you to be with the young women. I want you to be safe in the number of the women. But Ruth here understands who she is and where she is. And she seems to anticipate different treatment. She's not anticipating being treated so fairly or kindly. Block here wrote, she was amazed that differences of neither race nor class has stifled Boaz's compassion toward her. But here we see, closing it up here, Ruth's awareness of who she was what produced great thankfulness in her. When she was treated better than she knew she deserved. But if we turn that oppositely and we look at it, we see that pride prevents that thankfulness. I know we're 3 days late from being thankful, and none of us are thankful anymore, right? We were just waiting until next year to count our blessings once again. And so a message on thankfulness is completely inappropriate at this time in history. But without an accurate self-image, Ruth would not have been as thankful and as responsive to this generosity and to this kindness. And for us, it's the same. Without an accurate sense of who we are and who God is and what we did to God and what God has done for us, unless we really get that, we won't be thankful like we should be. We'll expect things. We look at, well, what has God given me? And we count what He didn't give us instead of what He did give us. I remember I heard a statement, I've heard it many times throughout my life, but if God never gave you anything else, He still gave you more than He deserved. If all you get to do is not go to hell, you got more than you deserved. Because if God gave me what I deserved, it looked very different than it looks right now. But what I do is I look at what you have and I say, I don't have that. The only time that we as humans, as a human race, as we say God's been good, is when good things happen to us. It's very hard for us to say, God's been good to me, when I get a report from the doctor that is less than stellar. When I get a pink slip from my job. When something negative happens, when the car breaks down, I know, oh, glory to God, He's been good. He at least gave us a car that lasted this long. No, we're thankful when the car gets fixed. We're thankful when the car, well, we're not even thankful when it doesn't break down. How many of you thanked God this morning that you could just breathe through your nose? Probably the only people that thought of that are the people that just got over the cold. They woke up and went, I can breathe. Thank you. We take the little things for granted. And the true spirit of thankfulness comes when we realize who we are. I'm not as good as I pretend to be. And God sees through that. And you're not as good as you pretend to be. God sees through whatever facade you put up. And when I say, all right, God, I'm not hiding anything. You know who I am. And I remind myself of how wretched and low and sinful I am. And then I remember what God did for me and how gracious and kind, much like Boaz was to Ruth, but on a much grander scale, I turn to him and say, just like Ruth, why would you do this for me? It's a great song, one of my favorite songs. It's titled, Who Am I? And it's about, who am I that the Lord of all the earth would care to know my name, would care to feel my hurt? Because He's so big, and I'm so little, and He's so important, and I'm so unimportant. Why would you do this? And it's the same attitude that Ruth has towards Boaz. We'll look at this so much. There's so much more here, and I feel like I didn't pare it down even enough to fill into one. But I'm so looking forward to as we get into the rest of this attitude. But just in this thankfulness attitude that Ruth has, we see the type of woman she is, and the generosity and the kindness and the unprovoked goodness that he shows to a foreigner. That he probably realized, I have a little bit of a responsibility to help her out, but he's so good to her. And he's so loving to her. And later on, he'll do even more for her. And he'll stick his neck out on the line. And he'll risk everything for this woman here. That's the same thing that God did for us. That's the gospel. That how God put His own Son out for us. He became one of us and became like us. But lived like none of us ever could. So that we could be with Him one day. That undeserved, that unprovoked kindness. In that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Why would God do the things that He does for us? Because He's good. Not because I deserved it. Not because I'm good. Not because I was worthy and I made myself all attractive. You realize if Ruth has been working out in the field all day, her hair isn't did. She's got sweat running down. Her mascara is well, they didn't wear mascara, I bet, in those days. She's not looking her best. And that's how Boaz finds her. And he says, here's water. Here's food. He's going to invite her to lunch here in just a minute. It's beautiful. Read the story. Read chapter 2 this week. Read it this afternoon and put yourself in that situation and put yourself in Ruth's situation knowing that I'm not welcome here. And I just so happen to come across the field of the one God who loves me despite of my background. In spite of what everybody else says around him, He's going to show me kindness. He's going to show me mercy. He's going to show me generosity. And we see that a very, very, very familiar story when we reflect upon our own salvation story. And I see someone who showed me great love, great generosity in a time when I didn't deserve any of it. God loved me. He gave Himself for me.